The heat from the auction pit rose in oily waves, searing the hem of Mira's emerald silk gown, but the fire in front of her was nothing compared to the predatory warmth of the 100 men watching her from the shadows. They sat in a semicircle of velvet-backed chairs, their faces obscured by the grotesque porcelain grins of harlequin masks and the pointed beaks of Venetian doctors. To them she was not Lady Mira Elwyn, daughter of an earl. She was a prized mare, a gilded asset, a desperate prayer for a family's survival. Her father stood by the stage, his eyes darting toward the floor, unable to meet her gaze. He had gambled away their lands, their name, and finally, his daughter. Going once, the auctioneer barked, his voice rasping through the humid air of the subterranean chamber. Going twice. The silence that followed was heavy, punctuated only by the crackle of burning cedar in the hearth. Mira kept her chin tilted upward, her hands outturned in a gesture of forced dignity, though her fingers trembled. She looked toward the ceiling, searching for a god she no longer believed in, waiting for the finality of the hammer. Glag! The gavel hit the wooden block. It didn't sound like wood on wood. To Mira, it sounded like the heavy thud of a coffin lid being hammered shut. Sold, the auctioneer cried, his finger pointing into the darkest corner of the room. To the Duke of Crowhurst, 50,000 sovereigns. A collective gasp hissed through the masked crowd. The vultures shifted in their seats, whispering of the Duke's reputation. They called him the Cold Conqueror, a man who had returned from the wars with more scars than mercy and a fortune that could buy the crown itself. From the shadows, Valen Crowhurst stepped into the flickering firelight. He was a monolith of teal velvet and jagged history. A silver-threaded cravat sat stiffly against his throat, and a thick, well-groomed beard framed a face that seemed carved from granite. But it was the scar that held Mira captive, a violent, vertical line that slashed through his left eyebrow and down his cheek, a permanent reminder of a life lived in blood. He didn't look at her with lust. He didn't even look at her with pity. He gripped 2 massive leather sacks of gold, his knuckles white, and dropped them onto the stage at her feet. The heavy thud of the coins drowned out the murmurs of the aristocracy. It was a transaction, pure and cold. "Come," he said. His voice was a low, gravelly command that brooked no argument. He didn't offer his hand. Instead, he turned on his heel, his heavy boots echoing against the stone floor. Mira stumbled off the pedestal, her legs feeling like lead as she followed the sweep of his dark coat through the gauntlet of masked men. They watched her with hungry, disappointed eyes, their entertainment for the evening cut short by the Duke's sheer dominance. The transition was violent. One moment, Mira was trapped in the suffocating, sweat-slicked heat of the auction room. The next, she was thrust out into the biting midnight air of London. A black carriage waited, its lamps flickering like the eyes of a beast. Valen climbed in first, disappearing into the shadows of the interior. Mira hesitated at the step, the cold wind whipping her hair across her face before she followed him into the velvet-lined dark. The door slammed shut with a finality that made her flinch. The interior of the carriage was a sensory whiplash. It smelled of expensive tobacco, aged leather, and the sharp, metallic tang of the frost outside. It was freezing. Valen had not lit the foot warmers. He sat across from her, a shadow among shadows, his silhouette motionless as the carriage lurched forward. The silence was a physical weight. Mira clutched her simple pendant, her heart hammering against her ribs so loudly she feared he could hear it. She waited for him to lean forward, to claim the prize he had just spent a fortune on, to demand the gratitude of a woman whose father he had just saved from the debtor's prison. "My lord," she whispered, her voice cracking, I am aware of the debt. I am prepared to fulfill my duties as your wife." She closed her eyes, bracing for the touch of his hand, for the inevitable degradation of being owned. "Do not touch the velvet," Valen's voice cut through the dark, as sharp as a blade. "It is cleaner than the men who sold you tonight, and I would prefer it stay that way." Mira's eyes snapped open. He hadn't moved. He was staring out the window at the passing street lamps, his scarred profile illuminated in rhythmic flashes of amber light. "I did not buy a wife, Lady Mira," he continued, his tone devoid of warmth. "I bought a silence. I bought a reputation, and most importantly, I bought your absence from that stage. I don't understand, she breathed, her brow furrowing. The marriage, the wedding night. Valen finally turned his head, his one good eye locked onto hers, cold and piercing. There will be no wedding night. You will have your own suite at Crowhurst. You will have your gowns, your servants, and your title, but you will not have me. I have no desire to touch a woman who was purchased like a piece of livestock. He leaned back into the shadows, his face disappearing once more. You are safe, Lady Mira, but you are alone. Consider which fate you prefer. The carriage rattled over the cobblestones, carrying them toward a manor that promised luxury and delivered a prison of ice. Mira sat back, the emerald silk of her dress rustling in the dark, realizing that the man who had saved her from the vultures was a predator of an entirely different kind, one who would kill her not with cruelty, but with the freezing vacuum of his indifference. The heavy iron doors of the Crowhurst carriage didn't just close, they sealed like a tomb. As the wheels began to grind against the London cobblestones, the high-octane roar of the auction house faded into a silence so thick it felt like a physical weight against Mira's chest. Only moments ago, she had been standing on a pedestal of scarred oak, the centerpiece of a room filled with the scent of unwashed bodies and expensive wax. The vultures, those masked titans of industry and title, had leaned forward in their chairs, their porcelain-white masks glowing in the orange light of the fire pit. Every time the auctioneer's voice climbed, Mira had felt a piece of her soul flake away. She was the last treasure of the Elwyn family, sold off to clear the ledger of a father who had loved the card table more than his own blood. Then the Duke had stepped forward. Valen Crowhurst hadn't looked like a savior. He had looked like a storm draped in teal velvet. When he dropped the sacks of gold, the sound had been violent, a blunt, metallic declaration of ownership that silenced even the most daring bidders. Now, sitting across from him in the flickering gloom of the coach, Mira found the reality of him even more terrifying than the auction block. The Duke sat perfectly still. The light of the street lamps stropped across his face in rhythmic flashes, illuminating the jagged scar that ran like a lightning bolt through his left eye. He didn't look at her. He didn't reach for her hand. He gripped the head of his silver cane with white-knuckled intensity, his broad shoulders filling the small space of the carriage. "My lord," Mira started, her voice a fragile thread in the dark. She forced herself to maintain the poise she had been groomed for since birth. "I believe it is custom for a bride to thank her husband for ensuring her safety." "Safety," Valen's voice was a low, abrasive rasp. He finally turned his head, his one good eye pinning her to the velvet seat. "Is that what you call this, Lady Mira? You were sold. I am a buyer. Let us not wrap a financial transaction in the silk of sentimentality." Mira flinched as if he had struck her. "Whatever you call it, you paid a king's ransom. My father's debts are gone. My family's name is preserved. I know what is expected of me in return for such a price." She reached for the gold lacing of her bodice, her fingers trembling. If this was the moment of her undoing, she wanted to face it with the dignity of a woman who chose her fate, rather than a girl who was dragged to it. "Stop," Valen commanded. The word hit her with the force of a physical blow. He leaned forward, his face inches from hers. Up close, he smelled of cold rain and old parchment. The scar over his eye was even more prominent, a raised, silvered ridge of flesh that spoke of a violence she couldn't imagine. His expression wasn't one of lust, but of a deep, simmering resentment. "You think because I bought the Elwyn name, I intend to soil it," he hissed. "I wanted the title to secure my borders. I wanted the alliance to quiet the whispers at court. I have no interest in the girl who comes with the deed." "But the marriage," Mira stammered, her face flushing a deep, mortified crimson. "The vultures, they will expect an heir. They will watch for proof that the union is real." "Let them watch," Valen said, reeling back into the shadows. "They will see a duchess in fine gowns. They will see a woman who lacks for nothing, but they will never see you in my bed. I did not buy a wife to touch her, Lady Mira. I bought a ghost to haunt my halls." He turned back to the window. The conversation ended. Mira sat in the freezing dark, clutching her simple pendant, the emerald silk of her dress feeling like a shroud. She had been sold to save her family, only to find that her buyer considered her a burden he didn't even want to look at. The carriage lurched as they left the city limits, heading toward the sprawling, lonely towers of Crowhurst Estate, leaving the heat of the auction fire far behind in the cold, night air. The transition from the sweltering pit of the auction house to the interior of the Duke's carriage was like plunging into a frozen river. Outside, the night air of London was thick with the scent of coal smoke and river mud, but inside the coach, the atmosphere was sterile, biting, and unnervingly quiet. Mira sat on the edge of the seat, her emerald green gown, once a symbol of her nobility, now feeling like a costume for a play that had turned into a tragedy. Her breath hitched in the back of her throat, emerging as a faint white mist. The carriage was cavernous, lined in a charcoal-colored velvet so deep it seemed to swallow the light of the passing street lamps. Across from her sat the man who had just traded a fortune for her life. Duke Valen Crowhurst did not lounge. He sat with a spine of iron, his gloved hands resting heavily upon the silver head of his cane. The jagged scar across his eye caught the rhythmic flash of the gaslight outside, a silver streak of violence in the gloom. Desperate to break the suffocating silence, Mira reached out, her fingers trembling as she sought to steady herself against the plush upholstery of the seat beside her. "Do not touch the velvet," Valen's voice sliced through the dark. It wasn't a shout, but a low, guttural rasp that carried the weight of a physical blow. Mira pulled her hand back as if the fabric had burned her. She looked at him, her wide eyes searching his face for a hint of the man behind the cold conqueror mask. "My lord, I only meant to." "It is cleaner than the men who sold you tonight," he interrupted, finally turning his head to look at her. His gaze was clinical, stripped of any warmth or desire, "and I would prefer it stay that way. You are a guest of necessity, Lady Mira, not a decoration for my furniture." The whiplash of his words left her reeling. In the auction room, the vultures had looked at her with a hunger that made her skin crawl, but Valen's gaze was worse. It was the look of a man inspecting a ledger and finding a clerical error. "Is that all I am to you?" she whispered, the simple pendant at her throat rising and falling with her shallow breaths. "A necessity? You paid 50,000 sovereigns. No man spends such a sum unless he intends to claim what he bought." Valen leaned forward, the movement sudden and predatory. The scent of cedarwood and cold rain moved with him, surrounding her. "You think too highly of your charms and too lowly of my coin, Lady Mira. I did not buy you for the pleasures of the bedchamber. I bought you to settle a debt of honor with your father and to ensure that the Elwyn name, tainted as it is, remains under my thumb rather than in the gutters of a brothel." He leaned back, the shadows reclaiming the scarred side of his face. "You wanted to save your family's name. It is saved. But the price of that salvation is your invisibility. Once we pass through the gates of Crowhurst Estate, you will exist in the West Wing. I will exist in the East. We shall be a marriage of ink and paper, nothing more." Mira felt a strange, hollow ache in her chest. She had prepared herself to be a sacrifice, to endure the touch of a monster to save her kin. But to be rejected entirely, to be told she was not even worth the Duke's interest, was a different kind of cruelty. It was a social death. "And when the world asks why the Duchess has no child," Mira asked, her voice gaining a sharp edge of defiance, "when the vultures whisper that the cold conqueror has no fire for his bride, what then, my lord?" For the first time, a ghost of a smile touched Valen's lips, though it did not reach his eyes. "Let them whisper. I have survived musket balls and betrayals. I think I can survive the gossip of bored aristocrats. You have your safety, Mira. Do not be so foolish as to trade it for my attention. You would find the latter far more dangerous." The carriage lurched as they left the cobblestones for the smooth, gravel drive of the countryside. The lights of London faded into a dull orange glow on the horizon, replaced by the towering, skeletal silhouettes of ancient oaks. Mira turned to the window. Watching the darkness swallow the world she once knew, she was no longer a lady, and she was not truly a duchess. She was a gilded ghost, traveling toward a house of stone and secrets, bound to a man who had bought her just to throw her away. The heavy iron gates of Crowhurst Estate groaned open like the jaws of a slumbering beast, swallowing the carriage into a world of mist and towering stone. As the coach came to a halt beneath the shadow of the great portico, The silence of the countryside felt heavier than the roar of London. Valen exited first, his tall frame cutting a sharp silhouette against the flickering torches held by a line of stony-faced servants. He did not wait for Mira. He simply walked upward, his silver-headed cane clicking rhythmically against the marble steps. Mira followed, clutching the emerald skirts of her gown to keep from tripping. The foyer was a cathedral of cold grandeur, soaring arched ceilings, floors of black and white checkered marble, and walls lined with the hollowed-out suits of armor from Crowhurst's long dead. The air here didn't carry the warmth of a home. It smelled of beeswax, old damp stone, and the metallic tang of a winter that had moved indoors. Valen stopped at the base of a sweeping grand staircase. He turned, the flickering torchlight catching the jagged scar on his cheek, making it look like a fresh wound. From the pocket of his teal velvet coat, he pulled a heavy ring of iron keys. They clattered as he held them out to her. "These will grant you entry to every room in this house, Lady Mira," he said, his voice echoing in the hollow space. "The library, the solarium, the kitchens, and the gardens. You are the mistress of Crowhurst in name. You may redecorate the parlors, you may command the servants, and you may spend the allowance I have deposited in your name. You have the keys to the house." Mira reached out, her fingers brushing the cold iron. For a moment, her skin grazed the leather of his glove, and she felt a jolt of heat that seemed at odds with his icy demeanor. She looked up at him, her wide, searching eyes meeting his one good one. "And your rooms, my lord? Does one of these keys open the door to the Duke's suite?" Valen's expression didn't soften. If anything, it hardened into a mask of granite. He pulled his hand away the moment the keys were in her grasp. "There is no key for that door, not for you, and not for anyone else. My rooms are a border you will not cross. Consider the hallway between the east and west wings to be an ocean. You stay on your shore, and I shall stay on mine." "Is this my life then?" Mira whispered, the weight of the iron keys pulling at her hand. "To be a queen of a palace where the king is a ghost. You give me the house, Valen, but you lock the door to the man who brought me here. Why buy me at all if you intended to remain a stranger?" Valen took a step closer, looming over her until she was forced to tilt her head back. The scent of cedar and old war smoke drifted from his clothes. "I bought you to save a name, not to share a life. You have the security you craved. You have the finery you were born to wear. Do not mistake my mercy for an invitation." He reached out, his gloved thumb hovering just inches from the delicate line of her jaw, never quite making contact. The restraint in his movement was more agonizing than a blow. "I am a man of scars and shadows, Mira. There is nothing in my heart but the debris of a dozen battles you wouldn't survive. Be content with the keys to the stone and mortar. The heart is not part of the deed." He turned abruptly, the heavy sweep of his coat billowing behind him like a shroud. He climbed the stairs without a backward glance, leaving Mira standing alone in the center of the vast, silent hall. She looked down at the iron keys in her palm, their cold edges digging into her skin. She had the power to open every door in the estate, yet she had never felt more locked out in her life. The wind whistled through the high rafters, a lonely sound that seemed to mock her. She was a duchess of a kingdom of dust, mistress of 1,000 rooms, and wife to a man who had built a fortress around his soul that no iron key could ever hope to turn. Fragile silence of Crowhurst estate was not destined to last. Within a fortnight, the icy isolation Mira had begun to accept was punctured by the persistent, rhythmic rattling of the manor's great iron gates. It began with a single carriage, then two, then a small cluster of black-clad figures who stood like crows against the morning mist. The rumors had traveled faster than the Duke's horses. The gilded sacrifice was a duchess in name only, and the cold conqueror had not yet branded his prize. Mira stood at the tall, narrow window of the morning room, her fingers tracing the cold glass. From this height, the men at the gates looked small, but their intent was massive. They were the creditors, the minor lords, and the professional vultures her father had fed for years. They were no longer afraid of a ruined earl, and they were beginning to lose their fear of a duke who refused to publicly claim his wife. In the cruel logic of the peerage, an unconsummated marriage was a vulnerable one, a legal loophole waiting to be exploited by anyone with a claim to the Elwyn debts. "They are waiting for a sign of weakness, your grace," a low, gravelly voice vibrated behind her. Mira didn't need to turn to know Valen was there. The temperature in the room always seemed to drop a few degrees in his presence. He stood by the fireplace, his teal coat exchanged for a dark charcoal frock that made his salt and pepper hair look like hammered steel. He held a stack of parchment, letters, no doubt, filled with demands and veiled threats. "They say the marriage is a sham," Mira said, her voice barely a whisper. She turned to face him, the emerald silk of her gown rustling like dry leaves. "They say that because the bed remains cold, the contract is void. They are here for the money you promised my father, and they are here for me." Valen tossed the letters onto a side table with a flick of his wrist. "They are here because they smell blood. They think that because I do not parade you through the streets of London like a trophy, I am incapable of defending what is mine." "And are you?" Mira took a daring step forward, her heart thumping against her ribs. "Defending me is not just about gates and guards, Valen. It is about perception. Every night you spend in the East Wing while I remain in the West is another brick they pull from the walls surrounding us. They don't just want the gold. They want to prove you are a monster who bought a girl he cannot love, so they can justify taking everything back." Valen's good eye narrowed, the scar over his brow twitching. He moved toward her, his boots heavy on the Persian rug, until he was close enough for Mira to see the individual threads of his lace cravat. He didn't touch her, he never did, but the sheer force of his proximity felt like a physical pressure. "I have spent my life in trenches and on blood-soaked fields," he hissed, his voice a dangerous rasp. "I do not fear the yapping of curs at my gate. If they want to test the validity of my ownership, let them try. I will pay the debts I agreed to, but I will not perform for the amusement of the ton." "It isn't a performance for them," Mira cried, her composure finally fracturing. "It is my life. If they break those gates, I am the one they will drag back to the auction block. I am the one who will be sold again to the next highest bidder. You promised me safety, but you are giving me a cage that is rotting from the outside in." For a fleeting second, something shifted in Valen's expression. A flicker of something that wasn't anger. Perhaps it was the ghost of a protective instinct he thought he had buried in the war. He reached out, his gloved hand stopping inches from her shoulder, his fingers curling into a fist as he forced himself to pull back. "The gates will hold," he said, though his voice lacked its usual iron certainty. "I will handle the creditors, but do not ask me to be the husband they expect, Mira. That man died a long time ago." He turned and strode from the room, leaving the door ajar. Outside, the shouting at the gates grew louder, a discordant chorus of greed that underscored the hollow luxury of the manor. Mira looked back out the window, watching the vultures circle. She realized then that Valen's iron wall was protecting no one. It was merely a target, and as long as he remained a stranger to her, they were both standing in the line of fire. The dust motes danced in the shafts of moonlight that pierced the library's towering windows, illuminating a world of leather-bound silence and forgotten history. Mira moved through the shadows like a wraith, the iron keys at her waist chiming softly with every step. Sleep had become an elusive stranger in the weeks since she had arrived at Crowhurst. The echoing hollers of the creditors at the gate still rang in her ears, and the cold expanse of her lonely bed felt more like a tomb than a sanctuary. She sought the library not for a story, but for a truth. If she was to be the duchess of this fortress, she needed to understand the man who held the light. In the deepest corner of the room, tucked behind a mahogany desk that smelled of stale brandy and gunpowder, she found them, a stack of vellum maps, yellowed and brittle with age. They weren't maps of the estate or the London streets. These were tactical charts of the peninsula, crisscrossed with jagged lines of red ink and frantic, handwritten notations in a script she recognized as Valen's. Mira traced a finger over a smudge of dried brown blood, she realized with a shudder, near a town called Talavera. Beside the map lay a series of sketches, far more intimate and devastating than the military movements. They were drawings of men, their faces etched with a raw, skeletal exhaustion, and in the center of the pile was a self-portrait. It was Valen, but younger, without the beard, and without the scar that now defined him. The man in the drawing looked upward, with the same wide-eyed vulnerability Mira had felt on the auction block. "A dangerous thing, curiosity," a voice rasped from the gloom. Mira gasped, spinning around. Valen stood in the doorway, the shadow of his heavy frock coat bleeding into the darkness of the hall. He wasn't wearing his cravat. His shirt was open at the collar, revealing the start of more jagged white lines that mapped his chest. He looked less like a duke and more like a survivor pulled from the wreckage of a storm. I couldn't sleep, Mira stammered, her heart hammering. She tried to slide the map back into the stack, but her sleeve caught on a heavy, brass-edged inkwell. It tipped, the dark liquid blossoming across the ancient vellum like a fresh wound. "Oh no, Valen, I'm so sorry." She lunged to stop the ink from ruining the sketches, her fingers frantic. In her haste, her hand brushed against the sharp, decorative edge of the desk's silver letter opener. A thin, hot line of pain flared across her palm. Valen was across the room in a blurred instant. He didn't stop to look at the ruined maps. He didn't growl about his lost history. Instead, he seized her wrist with a grip that was firm but surprisingly devoid of the violence she had come to expect. "Stay still," he commanded. He pulled her into the moonlight, his brow furrowed in intense concentration. For the first time, Mira saw his rugged mask crumble. The cold, distant conqueror vanished, replaced by a man who moved with the practiced, instinctual tenderness of a field medic. He reached into his pocket for a clean linen handkerchief, his movements steady despite the sudden proximity that made the air between them feel electric. He pressed the cloth to her palm, his thumb resting against the pulse point of her wrist. Mira watched him, breathless. From this distance, she could see the silver hairs in his beard and the deep, weary lines around his good eye. He wasn't looking at her as a piece of property or a social burden. He was looking at her as something fragile that needed to be mended. "It is a shallow cut," he muttered, his voice losing its abrasive edge. He began to wrap the linen around her hand, his fingers working with a gentleness that made Mira's eyes sting with unexpected tears. "You should not be here, Mira. This room is full of things that should have stayed buried." "I was looking for you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Not the Duke, not the man who bought me. I was looking for the man who drew these faces, the man who felt enough to remember them." Valen's hands faltered. He looked down at their joined hands, her pale, delicate skin against his dark, scarred knuckles. The silence was no longer a vacuum. It was heavy with the weight of things unsaid. For a heartbeat, Mira thought he might lean in. She thought he might finally bridge the ocean he had placed between them. "The man who drew those is dead," Valen said, though the iron was gone from his tone, replaced by a hollow ache. "He died in the mud. There is only the soldier left, Mira, and the soldier has nothing to give you." He finished the knot on the bandage, his touch lingering for a second too long before he abruptly released her. He stepped back into the shadows, the cold conqueror armor clicking back into place. "Go to bed, Duchess," he said, his voice once again a distant rasp. "The ink will dry, the blood will stop, but the maps stay where they are." Mira watched him retreat into the darkness of the east wing, her bandaged hand pressed to her chest. The cut on her palm strung, but it was the brief, ghost-like warmth of his touch that left the deeper mark. She had seen the crack in the ice. And she knew now that the Duke wasn't refusing to touch her because he found her repulsive. He was refusing because he was afraid of what might happen if he started to feel again. The invitation arrived not as a request, but as a summons, written in the sprawling, careless hand Mira had spent a lifetime dreading. Her father, the Earl of Elwyn, was coming to Crowhurst for dinner. He wasn't coming to check on his daughter's welfare. He was coming to see if the golden goose he had sold still had feathers left to pluck. Mira stood before the pier glass in her dressing room, the emerald green gown she had worn on the auction night hanging in the back of the wardrobe like a ghost. Today, she chose something different, a structured silk of deep, bruised plum, with a collar that sat high and stiff against her throat. Her maid had styled her hair with such precision it felt like a helmet of chestnut coils. As she reached for the simple pendant she always wore, her gaze fell on the white linen bandage still wrapped around her palm. The cut from the library was healing, but the memory of Valen's touch, that brief, shattering moment of gentleness, felt like a brand. She realized with a jolt of clarity that the cold conqueror no longer terrified her. The man who had bought her was a known storm, a predictable frost. It was her own blood, the man who had birthed her and then bartered her away, who held the true power to destroy what was left of her soul. She descended the grand staircase, the iron keys at her waist clacking rhythmically against the silk of her skirts. Valen was already in the drawing room. He stood by the window, his back to the door, his teal coat draped perfectly over his broad shoulders. He looked every bit the formidable Duke, yet Mira noticed how he gripped his cane. The silver head was nearly swallowed by his white-knuckled grasp. "He is here," Valen said, without turning. "I know," Mira replied, her voice steady despite the cold sweat dampening her palms. The heavy doors swung open, and the Earl of Elwyn blustered in. He looked smaller than Mira remembered, his face flushed from port and the desperate, frantic energy of a man who had spent his life running from the consequences of his own hand. He smelled of stale tobacco and false cheer. "Mira, my darling girl," he cried, reaching for her as if they were a family of gold-leafed sentimentality. "Look at you, a duchess in truth. Crowhurst, you've done wonders for her complexion." Mira stepped back, avoiding his embrace. The movement was instinctive. "Father, you look well. I assume the creditors have stopped haunting your doorstep since the Duke's gold arrived." The Earl's smile faltered, turning into something sharper, more wheedling. "Ah, well, the transition has been complicated. There were a few outstanding markers I hadn't accounted for, a gentleman's misunderstanding at the clubs." He turned his watery eyes toward Valen. "I was hoping, Crowhurst, that as family we might discuss a small extension, a bridge, if you will, to see the Elwyn estate through the winter." The air in the room turned brittle. Mira watched Valen. He didn't move, didn't growl, but the aura of menace radiating from him was palpable. "I bought your daughter, Elwyn," Valen said, his voice a low, terrifying rasp that made the Earl flinch. "I did not buy your gambling habits. Our transaction was completed the moment the gavel hit the block. If you have markers, I suggest you sell your remaining horses. Do not look to my coffers to fund your failures." "Now see here," the Earl blustered, his face darkening. "I gave you a girl of pure blood and impeccable breeding. Most men would be falling over themselves to show their gratitude, unless, of course, the rumors are true, unless you find yourself unable to enjoy the prize you paid for." Mira felt the blood drain from her face. The vultures at the gate were one thing, but to hear her own father weaponize her husband's trauma against her was a new depth of degradation. She looked at Valen, expecting him to roar, to throw the Earl out into the snow. Instead, the Duke turned slowly, his one good eye fixed on her father with a chilling, predatory stillness. "Your daughter," Valen said softly, "is the only thing of value your name ever produced. If you speak of her as a prize again, I will ensure that the only place you spend the winter is the debtor's prison I pulled you from." The Earl sputtered, his bravado collapsing like a house of cards. He looked at Mira, seeking an ally, but she stood tall, her hand resting unconsciously on the iron keys at her side. She saw him then for exactly what he was, a small, greedy man who had traded her life for a few more nights at the card table. "You should leave, father," Mira said, surprised by the iron in her own tone. "The dinner is cancelled. I find I have no appetite for the company of a man who sees his daughter as a debt to be collected." When the Earl finally retreated, scurrying out of the manor like a rat from a sinking ship, the silence that followed was thick with the scent of spent adrenaline. Mira leaned against the back of a chair, her legs trembling beneath her plum-colored skirts. "You stood your ground," Valen remarked. He was watching her, his expression unreadable, the scar on his face softened by the dimming light of the fire. "I realized I was afraid of the wrong monster," she whispered. She looked at the Duke, the man who had refused to touch her, and realized that his distance wasn't a rejection of her, it was his way of honoring her. He had bought her, yes, but he was the only man in her life who hadn't tried to use her up. In the House of Emerald Thorns, Mira realized that the cold conqueror was the only thing standing between her and the world that wanted to consume her. The storm that had been brewing at the gates finally broke, but not with the roar of creditors. It arrived as a torrential, freezing rain that hammered against the stone skin of Crowhurst estate, turning the world outside into a blurred landscape of grey and shadow. Inside, the manor felt more like a tomb than ever, the silence punctuated only by the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall. Mira moved through the west wing, her mind racing with the image of her father's cowardly retreat. She felt a sudden, frantic need to find the man who had defended her, not as a duke defending property, but as a man shielding a woman from a predator. Guided by a strange, magnetic pull she no longer tried to resist, she found herself at the heavy oak doors of the east wing. For the first time, she did not knock. She pushed the door open. The air in Valen's private study was thick with the scent of whiskey and the metallic tang of old iron. A single fire burned low in the hearth, casting long, dancing shadows across the rows of ancient books. Valen was there, slumped in a high-backed leather chair, his back to her. He had shed his armor. His teal velvet coat lay discarded on the floor like a fallen banner. More shockingly, the stiff white lace of his cravat had been torn away, tossed onto the desk beside an empty crystal tumbler. "I told you never to come here," he said, his voice a low, jagged rasp that sounded closer to a groan than a command. Mira didn't retreat. She stepped into the circle of firelight. "I am tired of living in a house of locked doors, Valen. I am tired of being protected by a man who treats his own reflection as an enemy." He turned his head sharply, and the breath caught in Mira's throat. Without the high collar and the structured velvet to hide him, the true extent of his history was laid bare. The vertical scar on his face was merely the beginning. It continued down his neck in a gnarled, silvery rope of keloid tissue, disappearing beneath the thin linen of his undershirt. Other marks, the jagged puckers of musket fire and the long, thin lines of saber slashes, marred the column of his throat and the broad expanse of his shoulders. He looked like a man who had been broken into 1,000 pieces and put back together by a blind god. Valen saw her gaze and recoiled, his hand flying up to cover the side of his neck in a gesture so full of shame it made Mira's heart ache. He looked away, his jaw tight. "Now you see it," he hissed, the firelight catching the moisture in his one good eye. "The reason I do not touch you, the reason I bought a ghost instead of a wife. You were sold to save a name, Mira. You were not meant to be tethered to a monster. No woman, certainly not one as beautiful as you, should have to endure the sight of this." "The sight of what, Valen?" Mira stepped closer, her plum-colored skirts whispering against the rug. "Scars, you think I see a monster." "I am a ruin," he roared, slamming his hand against the arm of the chair. The sound echoed like a gunshot. "I am a collection of old wars and fresh regrets. Every time I look in the mirror, I see a map of the men I've killed and the man I failed to be. I refuse to touch you because I would not have your hands discover what a grotesque thing I have become. I wanted you to have your dignity, even if you were bought." The realization hit Mira with the force of a physical blow. His cold conqueror persona wasn't built of indifference or cruelty. It was built of a profound, agonizing self-loathing. He hadn't been keeping her at a distance to punish her. He had been doing it to spare her from himself. "You think so little of me," Mira whispered. She reached out, her fingers trembling as she bridged the final few inches of the ocean between them. Valen flinched, his eyes closing as if bracing for a strike, but he didn't pull away. Mira's hand, still lightly bandaged from the library incident, settled against his cheek. She traced the line of the scar, her thumb moving over the rough, raised skin with a reverence that made him gasp. "My father saw me as a debt," she said, her voice dropping to a low, melodic thrum. "The men at the auction saw me as a prize. You are the only man who saw me as someone worth protecting, even from yourself." She slid her hand down to the gnarled skin of his throat, her palm resting over his frantic pulse. "These aren't grotesque, Valen. They are the price you paid to come back to me. They are the only honest things in this entire gilded city." Valen let out a shuddering breath, his forehead dropping against her shoulder. The iron wall didn't just crack, it vanished. He reached up, his large, calloused hand covering hers, pressing her palm more firmly against his scarred skin as if he were trying to absorb her warmth. For the first time, he didn't look like a conqueror or a duke. He looked like a man who had finally found his way home through the dark. "You are a fool, Mira," he choked out, his voice thick with emotion. "Then we are a well-matched pair," she replied. The fire in the hearth flared, casting them in a warm, amber glow. The keys at Mira's waist felt lighter than they ever had before. She realized then that the most important door in Crowhurst estate hadn't required iron to open. It had required the courage to see the man behind the mask and the love to tell him he was enough. The sanctuary of the study was shattered not by a storm of nature, but by the violent splintering of wood. The crash echoed from the ground floor, a jagged sound that tore through the fragile intimacy of the room. Valen was on his feet in a heartbeat, his transition from vulnerable man to lethal soldier so instantaneous it was dizzying. He didn't reach for his cane, he reached for a heavy flintlock pistol hidden in the shadow of his desk. "Stay behind me," he rasped, the tenderness of the previous moment replaced by a cold, predatory focus. Mira's heart hammered against her ribs as she followed him into the darkened corridor. The vultures had finally stopped circling the gates and found a way through the carcass. Below, in the black and white marble foyer, a man stood amidst the glass shards of the sidelights. He wore the fine, tailored coat of an aristocrat, but his face was obscured by the same leering harlequin mask Mira had seen at the auction. He held a heavy iron prybar in one hand and a guttering lantern in the other. "Crowhurst," the intruder called out, his voice slurred with brandy and misplaced bravado. "We've come to see the truth of it. The clubs have a wager, you see. 10,000 sovereigns says the cold conqueror is nothing but a hollow suit of armor. 10,000 says the girl is still as pure as the day you bought her." A low, guttural growl vibrated in Valen's chest. He didn't descend the stairs. He stood at the top like a dark god of vengeance. "You have 10 seconds to leave this house before I bury you in the gardens, Lord Thorn. I know your voice, even behind that coward's porcelain." The intruder, emboldened by drink and the desperation of his own mounting debts, laughed. "And if I don't, if I decide to see for myself what you're too broken to claim, the marriage is a fraud, Valen. If you haven't touched her, she's still fair game for the rest of us." The man lunged toward the stairs, his intent clear. He wasn't just there for a wager, he was there to humiliate the Duke by violating the one thing Valen had tried to protect. Before Mira could scream, Valen moved. He didn't use the pistol. He vaulted over the railing of the first landing, a dark blur of teal and shadow, landing with the heavy thud of a predator. He caught Thorn by the throat, the sheer force of the impact sending the harlequin mask skittering across the marble. "You speak of her as property again," Valen hissed, his voice a terrifying whisper that carried even to Mira at the top of the stairs. "And I will show you exactly how broken I am." Thorn struggled, swinging the iron bar, but Valen disarmed him with a sickeningly efficient twist of the wrist. The intruder was thrown back against a suit of armor, the metal clattering like a chorus of ghosts. But Thorn was not alone. 2 more masked figures emerged from the shadows of the dining hall, their blades drawn. "Mira, run!" Valen shouted. But she didn't run. She grabbed a heavy brass candelabra from a pedestal and descended, her plum-colored skirts billowing. She wouldn't be the prize they fought over. She would be the partner who stood beside the man who had sheltered her. In the chaos of the foyer, the distance Valen had maintained for weeks was forcibly dissolved. As the 2 newcomers lunged, Valen spun back toward the stairs to shield her. He wrapped a powerful arm around Mira's waist, hauling her flush against his chest. It was the first time she felt the full, unyielding strength of him, the heat of his body, the frantic beat of his heart against her shoulder, the raw power in his limbs. He fired the pistol into the ceiling, the deafening roar and the flash of sulphurous smoke freezing the intruders in their tracks. "The next ball is for your hearts," Valen snarled, his grip on Mira tightening, pulling her into the protective curve of his body. "Get out. Tell the rest of the vultures that the Duchess of Crowhurst is claimed. Tell them that if any man so much as whispers her name in a tavern, I will hunt him down and finish what the war started." The intruders, faced with the terrifying reality of a duke who was very much alive and very much armed, scrambled back through the shattered door, disappearing into the rainy night. Silence returned to the manor, heavy and smelling of gunpowder. Valen didn't let go. He remained anchored to her, his breath coming in ragged gasps against her ear. Mira could feel the scars on his neck pressing against her cheek, the rugged map of his trauma no longer a barrier, but a bridge. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice shaking with a fear he had never shown in battle. "No," Mira whispered, turning in his arms. Her hands went to his chest, feeling the wild, rhythmic thrumming of a man who was very much capable of fire. "I am not hurt, Valen. I am finally awake." He looked down at her, the mask of the cold conqueror shattered on the floor beside the harlequins. In the aftermath of the breach, the distance was gone. He didn't pull away this time. He leaned his forehead against hers, his hands gripping her waist as if she were the only thing keeping him tethered to the earth. The vultures had come to prove his impotence, but they had only succeeded in forcing him to realize that his touch was not a curse. It was the only thing that could make them both whole. The morning after the breach brought a clarity that the London mist could not obscure. The shattered glass in the foyer had been swept away, and the heavy iron gates were once again bolted, but the air inside Crowhurst estate had shifted. It no longer tasted of stagnant history and beeswax. It felt charged, like the moments just before a summer storm. Mira found Valen in the solar, the room where the morning sun hit the strongest. He was dressed for travel, his heavy charcoal coat buttoned to the chin, hiding the scars that had been laid bare the night before. On the low table between two velvet wingback chairs sat a single, wax-sealed document. "Your father's final markers have been cleared," Valen said, his voice regaining some of its gravelly distance, though he wouldn't meet her eyes. "And this," he gestured to the parchment, "is a deed of manumission and a legal separation. I have settled an estate in your name in the north. You are no longer a debt to be managed, Mira. You are free." Mira looked at the paper, then at the man who stood like a statue of salt by the window. The cold conqueror was trying to retreat into his fortress of ice. Having defended her with his life, he was now trying to save her from the burden of his company. "Is that what you think I want?" Mira asked, her voice a steady, clear bell in the quiet room. "To be sent away to a gilded cage in the north, while the man who saved me rots in this one?" "I am a buyer, Mira," Valen hissed, his hand tightening on the head of his cane until the silver groaned. "The transaction is complete. I bought your safety, and I have given it to you. There is no reason for you to remain tethered to a man who can only offer you the shadow of a life." Mira walked toward him, her steps slow and deliberate. She didn't stop until she was within the circle of his heat, until she could see the slight tremor in his scarred jaw. She reached up, and with a slow, steady hand, began to unbutton the high collar of his coat. Valen froze. "What are you doing?" "I am making a final transaction," she whispered, "one that has nothing to do with sovereigns or deeds." She pulled the heavy coat open, then reached for the silk of his cravat, unwinding it with the patience of someone who had all the time in the world. As the fabric fell away, revealing the jagged, silvered map of his throat, Valen tried to turn his face away. He looked like a man expecting a blow. "Look at me, Valen," she commanded softly. When he finally turned his one good eye to hers, he didn't find the pity he so clearly feared. He found a reflection of his own soul. Mira took his hand, the large, calloused hand that had fired a pistol to protect her, and guided it not to her waist, but to her own throat, resting his palm over her pulse. "You think you are the only one with scars," she said, her voice trembling with the weight of her own unmasking. "You think because mine are hidden beneath silk and breeding that they do not ache. I was sold by my own blood. I was stood on a block and priced like meat. I have spent my life pretending to be a porcelain doll so that no one would see how much I was breaking." She leaned forward, her forehead resting against his. "You gave me the keys to your house, but I don't want the stone and mortar. I am offering you the only thing I have left that hasn't been bought, sold, or bargained for." "And what is that?" Valen breathed, his thumb grazing the delicate line of her jaw, his touch finally losing its hesitation. "The truth," Mira said, "that I am terrified of a world without you, that the monster you see in the mirror is the only man I have ever felt safe with. I am not choosing freedom, Valen, I am choosing you." The deed on the table was forgotten as Valen's other hand came up to cup her face. He looked at her with an intensity that burned through the last of his rugged mask. For years, he had been a soldier of shadows, believing that his value died on the battlefield. But as Mira leaned into his touch, her vulnerability meeting his own, the cold vacuum of the manor was replaced by a sudden, living warmth. "You would stay," he asked, his voice breaking, "in this house with a man like me?" "Only if that man stops trying to buy my happiness and starts trying to share his own, she replied. Valen let out a long, shuddering breath, a sound that seemed to release a decade of held tension. He didn't kiss her then, that would come later, in the quiet of the night, when the ghosts had finally been laid to rest. Instead, he simply held her, pulling her into the hollow of his chest, as if she were the missing piece of his own fractured armor. Outside, the creditors were gone, and the vultures had scattered into the London fog. Inside, the Duchess of Crowhurst had finally opened the only door that mattered. She hadn't been saved by a duke, she had been found by a man. And in the silence of the solar, the final transaction was closed, not with the strike of a gavel, but with the quiet, rhythmic beating of two hearts that were no longer for sale. In the end, Mira's ultimate power move wasn't escaping the Duke. It was dismantling the fortress he'd built to hide his heart. It's a haunting reminder that the most unbreakable thing a woman can build isn't a wall to protect herself, but a bridge to lead a lost soul home. Provided, of course, she's the one holding the keys to every single door in the house. What did you think of Valen's transformation? Did he truly deserve the devotion of a woman he bought on a pedestal, or was his self-loathing just a convenient excuse for his coldness? And what about Mira? Should she have taken that deed to the northern estate and started a life of true independence, or was staying with the cold conqueror her bravest act of all? I know where I stand on this one, but I want to hear your take. Let's get a real debate going in the comments section below. If you enjoyed this saga of high-stakes auctions, scarred hearts, and reclaimed dignity, please smash that like button. It really helps the channel grow and lets me know you want more dark, atmospheric romances like this. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss an upload. Until next time, remember, you are the author of your own story.